What if a continent was discovered on paper before any human being had actually seen it? Not a vague legend, not a sea monster sketch in the corner. A coastline, a shape, a place that seems to sit where it shouldn't, like a spoiler printed centuries too early. Then you realize something worse. The map exists, you can look it up, you can zoom in, and once you do, the question becomes unavoidable. Who drew a continent before it was discovered? It starts with a quiet obsession shared by explorers, spies, and modern internet detectives, old maps that appear to know too much. Not they had good imagination. More like, they drew the right thing in the wrong century. One of the most famous examples is the Piri Reis map. In 1513, an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis compiled a world chart on gazelle skin. Only a fragment survives today, rediscovered in 1929 in Istanbul's Topkapi Palace. It shows parts of the Atlantic, the coasts of Europe and Africa, and the Americas. That alone is impressive. Columbus had only crossed the Atlantic a couple of decades earlier. But the rumor that made this map explode into pop culture is darker and more thrilling. Some people claim it shows Antarctica. The shape at the bottom of the fragment looks like a southern landmass. And Antarctica wouldn't be officially confirmed until the 19th century, with sightings in 1820 often credited to expeditions by Bellingshausen, Bransfield, and Palmer. So if the map really shows Antarctica, you're looking at a cartographic time machine. Then comes the second punch. There are claims it shows Antarctica without ice. As if the coastline underneath the ice sheet was known. As if someone had surveyed a frozen continent long before modern instruments, long before satellites, long before anyone had the technology to see through kilometers of ice. It feels like a locked room mystery. The map is in the room, the coastline is on the paper. The discovery is centuries later, so who had the key? And Piri Reis isn't alone. There are other maps that seem to whisper the same impossible idea. The planet was mapped earlier than we admit. Take Oronce Fine's world map from 1531. Fine was a French mathematician and cartographer. His map includes a large southern continent, a Terra Australis, drawn with detail and imagination. It wraps around the South Pole like a missing puzzle piece, as if the Earth simply requires balance, land in the south to match land in the north. Then there's the Buache map from 1739. Philippe Buache was a prominent French geographer. He drew Antarctica as if it had two major landmasses separated by a channel, something that sounds strangely close to modern discussions of subglacial basins and the way ice divides the terrain. Again, the feeling is uncanny, like you're catching history cheating. The hypothesis begins to form in your mind, almost against your will. Maybe someone had older source maps. Maybe ancient civilizations voyaged farther than we think. Maybe knowledge survived disasters, wars, library fires, the slow grinding loss of records. Maybe the age of discovery was actually an age of rediscovery. Now you start seeing supporting facts everywhere. You learn that Piri Reis himself wrote notes on the map saying he compiled it from multiple earlier charts, including Portuguese maps, and famously, a map associated with Columbus. Not one miraculous act of drawing, but a collage of sources. That makes it feel more plausible, not less. If it's compiled, then the question shifts. What were those sources? Then you remember how capable ancient and medieval navigators could be. The Polynesians crossed the Pacific using stars, swells, birds. Norse sailors reached Greenland and Newfoundland. Arab and Chinese navigators mastered monsoon winds and trade routes across the Indian Ocean. Human beings have always been more mobile than the tidy timeline suggests. And mapping isn't just art, it's math. Latitude is relatively straightforward to estimate with the sun and stars. Longitude, historically, was the nightmare. Before accurate marine chronometers in the 18th century, longitude estimates were often wrong by hundreds of kilometers, yet some old maps get certain placements surprisingly close. Not consistently, not perfectly, but just enough to make you wonder if there were tricks we lost. You dig deeper, and the mystery escalates. Because the problem isn't just, did someone imagine a southern continent? People did imagine it. The problem is when the imagination seems to brush against reality in the right way, when outlines resemble coastlines, when proportions feel too intentional. when separate map makers across centuries keep drawing something in the south. You start connecting fields that don't normally talk to each other. Geography meets myth, exploration meets politics, cartography meets psychology. You notice that old maps weren't only tools, they were arguments. A map could claim territory, it could flatter a king, it could sell a voyage, it could fill empty space with confident ink because emptiness looked like ignorance. A blank area was an invitation for rivals to step in. So you ask a sharper question. Is this a case of forbidden knowledge, or just the human need to complete the picture? Then you stumble into the names that shaped the modern legend of maps that shouldn't exist. In the 20th century, Charles Hapgood argued that some ancient maps preserved accurate knowledge from a much earlier civilization. His book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, suggested that certain maps, including Piri Reis, might trace back to sources from a time when the Earth was surveyed more thoroughly. Hapgood even corresponded with Albert Einstein, who wrote a short, cautious foreword to one of Hapgood's works. Not an endorsement of the thesis, but enough to make people lean in. If Einstein's name is anywhere nearby, your brain treats the whole thing as weightier than it might be. And Antarctica itself adds fuel to the fire. The continent is strange. It hides its bedrock under an ice sheet that stores most of Earth's fresh water. It's the coldest, driest, windiest place on the planet, and it was the last continent confirmed by modern exploration. That gap, this huge white unknown, creates room for stories. If a map seems to fill that gap early, it feels like a secret slipping through. But then, around this point, your investigation hits a wall made of boring details, the kind that ruin good myths. Because when experts analyze these maps closely, the Antarctica starts to look less like a revelation and more like a misreading. The dominant scientific explanation is not that someone mapped Antarctica. It's that you're seeing patterns in ambiguous shapes. On the Piri Reis map, the southern landmass can be interpreted as the coast of South America stretched and rotated, drawn with the distortions you'd expect when combining sources of uneven quality. Cartographers of the time often had incomplete coastlines, copied and recopied, with errors amplified each generation like a whispered rumor. Projection matters too. Translating a round Earth onto flat parchment can warp shapes in ways that feel eerily meaningful if you're hunting for meaning. And that ice-free Antarctica claim runs into a hard reality. We did not have a clear, accurate picture of Antarctica's coastline beneath the ice until modern geophysics, using radar, gravity measurements, and seismic methods. The idea that a 16th century map preserves that hidden coastline is extraordinarily unlikely. Not impossible in the logic of stories, but unsupported by evidence in the logic of science. Then there's Terra Australis itself. For centuries, European mapmakers believed in a great southern continent not because they had seen it, but because they expected it. It was a philosophical and geometric idea going back to ancient thinkers. The world should have balance. Northern continent seemed too much, so surely the south had to compensate. This wasn't secret knowledge. It was a common assumption. They drew it the way you might draw the other side of the moon before seeing it, not from observation, but from symmetry. Even Buache, who produced sophisticated geographic hypotheses, was working in a time when mapping often blended observation with theory. He proposed what he thought might exist based on currents, ice reports, and the logic of landmasses. Sometimes a wrong method can still stumble toward a shape that resembles truth, not because it's a memory of ancient surveys, but because nature has patterns and humans are good at guessing patterns. So the story shifts. Maybe the map doesn't prove a hidden civilization. Maybe it proves something more ordinary and more unsettling. You can be convinced by a coastline that isn't really there. But the twist doesn't erase the mystery, it refocuses it. Because even if Antarctica isn't on that parchment, the question remains, why do these maps feel like they're winking at you? Here's the conflict. The mainstream explanation, distortion, compilation, projection errors, and imagined continents, accounts for a lot. It explains why the shapes are close but not quite right. It explains why details dissolve under scrutiny. It explains why accuracy often depends on how you rotate, crop, and interpret the image. Yet it doesn't fully explain the emotional power of the illusion. You're not crazy for seeing it, your brain is built for it. Humans are pattern finders. You see animals in clouds, faces in outlets, meaning in coincidence, and a map is a perfect trap because it already promises meaning. Lines on a map are supposed to correspond to reality, so when you spot something that resembles modern knowledge, it feels like a breach in time. There's also a deeper gray area. Some early maps really did preserve fragments of real information that traveled through unexpected channels. Knowledge moved with sailors, merchants, prisoners, and pirates. Maps were copied, stolen, translated, and simplified. A single accurate portolan chart could influence generations. Even myths can contain geographic hints, not because someone had satellites, but because people talk, travel, and remember. And we shouldn't underestimate compilation. Piri Reis wasn't claiming divine revelation. He was doing what information age humans do every day, aggregating sources. If one of his sources contained a rough coastline or a traveler's report, it could imprint onto his final work. The result might resemble a modern outline, just enough to spark legends centuries later. So where does that leave you? Between two uncomfortable ideas. On one side, the romantic temptation. That history is missing a chapter, that someone knew the world earlier, that the past was more advanced and more secret than we're taught. On the other side, the colder possibility. That your certainty can be manufactured by perspective, by selective interpretation, by the way your mind snaps vague shapes into familiar answers. And maybe that's the real reason the map shouldn't exist. Not because it proves an impossible continent, but because it exposes how easily a line becomes a story. You start the investigation hunting for a hidden explorer. You end it staring at the machinery of belief, how evidence becomes myth, how myth demands evidence, and how both can coexist on the same aging parchment. So the next time you see an old map with a suspicious coastline, you can ask two questions at once. What did they really know? And what are you desperate to see? Because sometimes the most mysterious continent isn't the one drawn too early. It's the one your mind draws in the empty spaces.